Mass Effect is a game that scares me. It's one of my all-time favourites. I've made several videos about it before, but they've always been on a specific topic. Like that one time I made a whole video about Jacob Taylor for some reason.
Nice.
To just talk about the games as a whole feels daunting. Mass Effect is one of the most famous RPGs of all time. It defined the modern face of BioWare and the modern face of RPGs, and with good reason. It's just an absolutely phenomenal series of games. That also means they've been analysed to hell and high water, which can make the idea of having anything meaningful to say about them feel a bit silly. But, as I do every couple of years, I got the itch to play Mass Effect again, and me being me, I needed an excuse to do that. Because viewed through a critical lens, Mass Effect 1 becomes an even more impressive accomplishment. It's a game of absolutely remarkable vision, bursting at the seams with creativity and ambition. It doesn't always hold together as well as it wants to, but it always impresses, even 18 years later. The most intimidating thing about making a critique of Mass Effect is just knowing where to start, which is ironic because knowing where to start is what makes Mass Effect so remarkable. BioWare made a name for itself in the late 90s and early 2000s with licensed RPG games, like Neverwinter Nights or Baldur's Gate, which are both set in the D&D universe, or Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. But even in 2003, they had a desire to make their own universes, something they could fully control and mould exactly to their liking. Their first attempt at doing this was a game called Jade Empire in 2005, but the two big projects would be a new fantasy universe and a new sci-fi universe, Dragon Age and Mass Effect, each being developed at the same time by two different teams within the studio. The two games and the two franchises are such interesting mirrors of each other. One of the original names for Mass Effect was Space Age to cement the parallels between the two franchises, but they picked Mass Effect because it sounds cooler and more unique. Mass Effect would look forward, trying to reinvent the RPG genre and blend it much more directly with action games than had never really been tried before. Meanwhile, Dragon Age would look backwards and create a lush, high-definition spiritual successor to the fantasy BioWare games of old. As the years went on, Dragon Age would borrow some stuff from Mass Effect, and Mass Effect would borrow some stuff from Dragon Age. But both franchises would eventually cement themselves in the modern RPG canon because of their commitment to these parallel paths. Although I can't pretend that I don't have a favourite. I love Dragon Age and I'm sure I'll get to it one of these days, but as a sci-fi fan through and through, I love Mass Effect just a little bit more. I've probably played through the trilogy at least 20 times over the years, and I'll probably do it again. I think part of the reason it's so replayable is that forward-thinking design. It's just a lot more approachable than Dragon Age Origins is, by design. And it all begins, like most good RPGs do, with a character creation screen. Mass Effect is the story of Commander Shepard, a space marine living in the year 2183, and the mission that propels them into the role of a galactic hero. This is one of the big mix-ups that Mass Effect makes to the RPG formula. You play as a named and fully voiced protagonist. It's a concept that goes against a lot of the core principles of the previous generation of RPGs. It's useful to contrast Mass Effect's protagonist to Dragon Age Origins, which technically came out a year later, but as a backwards-looking title it takes a much more traditional approach. Dragon Age Origins allows you to pick from 3 different races and 6 different fully playable prologue backstories for your main character. These options allow for much more player freedom in the creation process and role-playing experience, but there is a trade-off. The hero of Ferelden, no matter how you play, just doesn't have a very solid personality. They are a player vessel much more than they're a character. Commander Shepard is different. You can choose from a few backstories, you can choose from a variety of combat classes, you can fully customize Shepard's face and if they're a man or a woman. But at the end of the day, Shepard will always be Shepard. They have a name, they have a voice, and they have a life outside of the player's involvement in it. A lot of people say that Mass Effect is a worse RPG than Dragon Age because of this, and if you view good RPGs as being purely defined by player freedom, then that's absolutely true. Dragon Age Origins allows you to make much more divergent heroes and make much more divergent choices than you ever get to make with Shepard. But to me, Mass Effect is not a worse RPG, just a different one. It has vastly different goals to Dragon Age. Shepard is supposed to feel like a real character, as real as all of the companions you spend the game interacting with. Not a player creation like the hero Ferelden, but an actual written protagonist like you'd get in a game that isn't an RPG. You can fight against that and try and make Shepard your own, or you can lean into it even harder. Shepard's default facial model is not just one of the stock models of the character creator, but a 3D scan of a real person, a Dutch model named Mark Vanderloo. Vanderloo was chosen specifically because he has quite striking, bold features. That's why he's a professional model, and so by extension, default Shepard is much more distinct looking than any face you could possibly make with the game's creation tools. The game almost encourages you in its UI not to make a custom face. You have multiple options to skip the character creator entirely and just begin the game with good old Mark. Playing this way fundamentally changes your relationship with Shepard compared to previous generations of RPGs. He is not your creation. He is a character you are controlling. The same applies to the female Shepard. Arguably applies even better, but that's a whole different can of worms which we'll get into later. It's part of the genre-blending, forward approach that makes Mass Effect so revolutionary. And it's an approach to protagonists that many RPGs going forward would start to incorporate, including Dragon Age 2. The reason, I think, is that it plays better to the strengths of the medium. Most Western RPGs are derived in some form from Dungeons & Dragons. As mentioned, the early BioWare RPGs were even set in the Dungeons & Dragons universe and used D&D rule sets for their gameplay. Dungeons & Dragons as a tabletop RPG is all about player freedom. The only limit of the game is imagination. This is just fundamentally not true of video games. Video games have limitations. You can only ever do what the artists, writers, and programmers were able to create. D&D inspired RPGs often chafe against these limitations in frustrating ways. Dragon Age cannot give a player true freedom, it can only give them a lot of freedom. But you can't just stab Duncan in the first 10 minutes, the game will not let you do that no matter how hard you try. So Mass Effect's approach is to not fight these limitations, but embrace them. To take control away from the player and limit their options to the benefit of the character they're controlling. Shepard doesn't have a defined personality. They have two defined personalities to choose between, Paragon or Renegade. Each offers a different but concrete character in a way that most RPGs before Mass Effect don't have, and a lot of RPGs after Mass Effect do. The personhood of Shepard is an aspect of the series that only gets stronger as the games go on, but it has a strong start here in Mass Effect 1. Shepard is the anchor that the entire experience is built around. Dependable, curious, brave, and entirely human. The perfect window into a strange alien world. Compared to the openings of all the other games in the series, Mass Effect 1 takes it slow. You can spend a full 20 minutes in conversations before you ever fire a gun. Mass Effect 2, 3, and Andromeda don't last more than 5 minutes before the explosions start happening, but this slow start is a key choice for easing the player into the incredibly dense world that BioWare created. After playing the game so many times, it's hard to get back into the mindset of someone who needs it all explained, but Mass Effect does an absolutely expert job of introducing all of its various sci-fi concepts and aliens at a slow and steady pace that never feels too overwhelming. Dragon Age more or less yeets you right into the thick of it, but it can do that because Dragon Age is playing with familiar fantasy concepts like elves and dwarves and magic. Mass Effect has to introduce an entire galaxy from scratch, so it starts that process slowly. You're a human, on a human ship, being sent to investigate a human colony on the backwater planet of Eden Prime. It's a little strange that they'd send you on this mission, but otherwise this is a mundane place for the game to begin. Humanity is much the same as we are now. Whether it's a battleship or a starship doesn't change the dynamics of a military vessel. It's from this baseline that the game starts drip-feeding you the universe. First you meet Nihilus, the one alien aboard your ship, the Normandy. He's a Turian Spectre, an elite agent for an alien power called the Citadel Council. You can talk to another crew member, Navigator Presley, about Nihilus, and he expresses mistrust about having a Turian on board, dropping reference to the First Contact War. These brief exchanges start informing your understanding of the setting. It's sci-fi, there's aliens, but First Contact was recent enough that people still talk about it with first-hand experience. There is some sort of galactic government with various alien races that humanity is now a part of, but there's still animosity between at least humans and Turians. The game also very quickly introduces the big sci-fi concepts like the mass relays, a network of giant space slingshots built and then abandoned by a race called the Protheans thousands of years ago, which now serve as the backbone of galactic society. But more importantly for their introduction, they look cool, which communicates their purpose well enough all on its own. On the surface of Eden Prime, you find it under attack by a race of sentient machines called the Geth. The Geth were not made by humanity or the Council. They're a third party, mistrusted by both, which establishes that while the Council is a power in the galaxy, they're not the only power in the galaxy. They're being led by another Turian, a rogue spectre named Saren, and they're after the same thing you are, a Prothean beacon. No matter which background you pick for Shepard, they are always unfamiliar with most of this stuff, so there's an in-universe reason to ask a bunch of basic questions. Or to just ignore those questions because Shepard is a professional soldier who's ready to get down to business. Either way you choose makes sense for the established character. All controlled through one of Mass Effect's most important innovations, the dialogue wheel. Rather than the traditional list of responses most RPGs used, Mass Effect gives you a wheel with a selection of up to 6 responses, usually split so that the left side will ask a question, and the right side will advance the conversation. The wheel does not represent what Shepard will actually say, instead they suggest the tone with which Shepard will speak. Will you take the high road, the low road, or walk the middle? Paragon, renegade, or neutral? So much of Mass Effect's design is about streamlining the RPG genre into something more widely approachable, and the dialogue wheel is the best example of that. Rather than the one-sided conversations of classic RPGs, dialogue in Mass Effect simulates a natural conversation. Your input guides the tone of that conversation rather than the words that are being said. Are you going to be nice, or are you going to be a dick? It vastly reduces the complexity of conversations, another thing which demotes Mass Effect in the minds of some RPG purists, but it's also a vastly more approachable system to general audiences, which is the reason so many games have stolen the dialogue wheel since, like Fallout 4 or Assassin's Creed Shadows, or pretty much every game in the Telltale catalogue. Mass Effect makes a deliberate attempt to be cinematic in a way that the previous generation of RPGs were too limited by technology to aim for. It prioritises the look and flow of a conversation just as much as the substance of those conversations. Another way this is accomplished is in who you're talking to. The game is peppered with quite a few recognisable sci-fi voices, most notably Keith David as Captain Anderson, Shepard's mentor, Seth Green as Joker, your wisecracking pilot, Lance Henriksen as Admiral Hackett, the guy who gives you most of the game's side quests, and Marina Sirtis as Matriarch Benezia, Saren's right-hand lady. Also, as a Trekkie, I'd be remiss not to point out that Presley is voiced by Dwight Schultz, and Armin Shimmerman pops up in a couple different roles too. The game aims high with its cinematic touches. One that became a franchise staple is the use of lens flares. They are all over the place, and the Legendary Edition makes the lens flares even more prevalent than they were in the original release. They can sometimes be a little excessive, but for the most part they do work in giving the game a sleek sci-fi look, similar to the Star Trek reboot that would come out a few years later. Dialogue doesn't always land so well. Some of the animations are a bit stiff and unnatural, especially compared to modern games, and some of the dialogue itself can be a bit clunky as well. But the overall effect of natural conversation never goes away. Eden Prime gives you quite a few opportunities to familiarise yourself with these new systems before throwing you into the greater galaxy. Like a couple of surviving scientists or a few farmers who you can discover have been helping out a smuggler over in the port. Small, low-stakes conversations and scenarios to get you thinking about which Shepard you want to be. But Eden Prime ends with a tease of much greater things. The beacon activates and gives Shepard strange, cryptic and sinister visions of something. Something mechanical and something apocalyptic. The next port of call is the Citadel to try and expose Saren as a traitor and get help hunting him down. This is where the game opens up and throws you into the deep end now that you've dipped your toes and are comfortable enough in Shepard's boots. The cutscene introducing the Citadel is one of my favourite moments of the game, and a moment that really cements what makes Mass Effect so wonderful to explore. is, for the most part, military sci-fi, the sci-fi of war and soldiers. But what differentiates it from other military sci-fi like Halo or Gears of War is its tremendous sense of wonder and whimsy. One of Mass Effect's most important inspirations is the work of Sid Mead, a tremendously talented artist who did concept work for Star Trek as well as many other famous sci-fi classics like Blade Runner and Aliens. Mass Effect is sort of a retro sci-fi project, though not nearly to the same extent as something like Fallout. The main thing it borrows from old 50s and 60s sci-fi is the wonder and the whimsy, and a little bit of the campy fun as well. The Citadel is the heart of galactic civilization, a city-sized space station floating gracefully in a cloudy white nebula. It's all done up in this sleek Art Deco style and full of weird and wonderful aliens in all shapes and sizes. It's hardly utopian, it's a place of politics and intrigue. But no matter how cynical things might get, the sense of wonder never truly goes away. There is an old sci-fi magic to the place. The game's ability to portray crowds is severely lacking, but the space is still tremendously evocative. It feels 1,000 miles away from humble Eden Prime, and it's a place where Shepard and their human crew feel very out of place. There are human faces on the Citadel, but they're just one of many faces in the crowd, and hardly the dominant faces. The other thing Mass Effect borrows from classic sci-fi are the tropes, particularly with the different kinds of aliens in the universe. Most aliens you meet are bipedal and about human height. The kinds of aliens you can imagine a talented costume designer pulling off with enough paint and rubber. But then you have a few wacky designs like the Elcor, these massive hulking creatures who look a bit like a seal with legs, or the Hanar, a race of pink telepathic jellyfish. But the two most important races when it comes to the old sci-fi tropes are the Solarians and the Asari. Mass Effect takes a lot of influences from Star Wars and Star Trek, but something it does very differently to either of those franchises is its approach to world building. Star Wars and Star Trek both have backwards world building. An alien showed up in the background of A New Hope for 5 seconds because the makeup and costume designers had a fun idea, and then it's someone else's job to figure out that alien's whole deal. Mass Effect was a world long before it was a story. The team took a whole year fleshing out the universe before they ever decided what would happen in it, and that feeling of thought-outness comes through in every corner of the Citadel. The Solarians are a take on the little green men from Mars trope. They have green skin, tall skinny proportions, and big black eyes. They also talk fast and have a reputation for being book-smart science types. What Mass Effect does is take these tropes and ask, then what? Expanding on the old tropes until they resemble an actual species and culture. There are codex entries that go way deeper than you'll ever hear about in the actual game, like how the Solarians lay eggs, how their fast metabolism means they typically don't live past the age of 40, and pages of Solarian history, how they fit into the wider galaxy, and how their influence has affected other races in the galaxy. An old critique that Dungeons & Dragons has tried to address in its modern incarnation is how it could often play into racial essentialism. Orcs are all low intelligence, elves are all good at archery, or races that are categorised as pure evil, like the Drow. This became a point of contention because it's a similar leap in logic that leads to stuff like phrenology, the idea that some real-life human races are inherently smarter and stronger than others, when in reality it's a pretty relative concept, and morality is obviously not a genetic trait. And while that's important, I think for me the issue is that this leads to less interesting worlds. If all orcs have to be dumb, then all orcs have to be the same, which is boring. And that's not how real people work. Real people come in all shapes and sizes, and if orcs don't, then orcs don't feel like real people. This is a problem which Mass Effect tackles head on. There are in-universe stereotypes and cliches about the Solarians, like the idea that they're all really smart, scientifically minded, and physically weak. These stereotypes, like a lot of stereotypes, are rooted in some amount of truth. There are a lot of Solarian scientists and they do tend to be quite smart, but also, like real-life stereotypes, they are not hard rules, and plenty, if not most of the Solarians you meet in the game don't fall into the stereotypes. The 3 most prominent Solarians in the game are a politician, a businessman, and a soldier. Captain Kirigi especially is a great example of a total subversion of a Solarian stereotype. He's a warrior, a strategic warrior, sure, but a warrior, a man of action and bravado and big speeches. He's still a Solarian and his species is a part of him, but it does not define him. The best example, though, is the Asari. The Asari are a take on a very old, very dated trope. The sexy alien babes. A very 60s trope. But despite how awkwardly they talk about it in the making of material, the Asari are an incredibly complex and interesting deconstruction of the old tropes. The Asari are a race of monogendered sexy blue alien women. Then what? What does that mean? Biologically, politically, culturally? Starting with biology, what does reproduction look like for a species without gender? Cooperative parthenogenesis, of course. The Asari have some amount of telepathic ability which allows them to combine the essence of their partner with their own to create a new Asari. And because this is a spiritual connection, they can do this with anyone of any gender of any sentient species. They are pansexual as a species. Gender has no meaning for them outside of the ways which it applies to the other species of the galaxy. They are female in the sense that they give birth and typically use female pronouns and titles, but gender as a biological or social concept doesn't really exist for them. This idea that Asari can mate with anyone leads to in-universe stereotypes and rumours of Asari promiscuity. A reputation that they are just like the sexy space babes of old sci-fi, something which plenty of Asari are happy to play into. One of the major locations on the Citadel is an Asari strip club. But, like the Solarians, this is hardly the whole truth of the Asari. The Asari live for 1,000 years and are also the most powerful and influential species in the galaxy. They were the first to develop faster-than-light travel and the first to discover the Citadel, itself another relic of the Protheans. But unlike the Turians and their military power, the Asari favour soft power. As a people who live for millennia, they are patient, typically mediating galactic politics rather than getting directly involved in them. Across the game, you encounter a huge range of Asari, wise counselors, shrewd businesswomen, pirate slavers, and the most important Asari in the game, Liara, a bookworm archaeologist and one of your main companions. At the end of the day, they are a race of sexy alien babes like the trope, but the game refuses to stop there. The Asari are people, just like the Solarians or the humans are. It's not all perfectly handled, there is a clear hierarchy of importance to the aliens in the game. There's never a Hanar main character, and even though they have a thought-out culture, biology, and history like the rest of the galaxy, they're often the butt of jokes more than anything else. But this hierarchy is also a very intentional part of galactic politics. The Citadel Council is made up of 3 species: Turians, Asari, and Solarians. Humanity is making a big push to get on the council. And while humanity feels like they have to kick and scream for any concessions, it's pretty clear looking around the Citadel that actually the Council has some clear favouritism towards humanity. Just next door to the human ambassador's massive office, the Elcor and Volus ambassadors have to share an office. Historically, the Volus, a race of stubby mole-like guys in bulky pressure suits, have been a part of galactic society since before the Turians, but they're still not part of the Council, because, despite the name, the Council are not as democratic as they appear. Membership is based on military power and territory more than it is on true democratic representation. Humanity might be the new kid on the block, but they are by no means the least powerful. Because all technology in the galaxy is based on the Protheans, so even though humanity are newcomers, they enter at a level of technology on par with everyone else because they got their tech the same way everyone else did. It's a clever twist that you can totally miss if you don't look around. Characters like Presley, Ambassador Dina, or even Shepard, if you choose to play that way, are too human-centric to see that to the rest of the galaxy, humanity are aggressive, pushy assholes who barged into the Senate and immediately demanded that they be in charge. And scarily, they have the military power to back it up. Because it's not just biology and history that make a world feel real, it's also the perspectives on those things. Right and wrong perspectives that you're thrown into the middle of and have to sort out which ones you subscribe to. Maybe, just maybe, humanity is not the underdog that folks like Udina think they are. Saren, your nemesis, is explicitly anti-human. He thinks they're growing too fast and are a threat to the Citadel races. And if you play a full-on renegade Shepard, then he is absolutely correct. The game can end with humanity making a push for control of the Citadel in a power grab orchestrated by Shepard. But maybe you've decided you're fine with that. After all, the Council are a pack of ineffectual, annoying bureaucrats who undermine and ignore you throughout the entire game. Maybe the galaxy could do with a fresh perspective. Let me tell you, saving them does not improve their attitude much going forward. This is the exact split that Paragon and Renegade are built on. It will probably not surprise any of my regular viewers that I'm a pure Paragon sort of player, but it goes a little deeper than that because I have a confession to make. As mentioned, I've done at least 20 playthroughs of the trilogy over the years, and never once in all of those playthroughs have I committed to a full Renegade run. I'm hardly alone in this. A few years back, one of BioWare's cinematic designers tweeted out that something like 92% of all Mass Effect playthroughs were Paragon. I played Paragon again this time, as I always do, but I also forced myself to do a Renegade run as well, for footage gathering purposes if nothing else. And I think playing the game that way really exposes why the statistics are so skewed. Mass Effect's design heavily encourages you to commit to one path or the other. You have meters that measure Paragon and Renegade scores, and some dialogue options in the latter half of the game are locked behind having a high Paragon or Renegade score. Despite what you may think, the game does not conceptualize Paragon and Renegade as good and evil. Instead, it designates a difference in approach. A Paragon is noble, by the book, empathetic, and maybe a little naive. A Renegade is ruthless, efficient, cold and cynical, but not evil. Often, a Paragon choice and a Renegade choice will lead to the same outcome. You can threaten these guards to scare them off, or you can convince them to leave diplomatically. Either way, you are saving their lives, because otherwise you just have to kill them. While all of this sounds okay, I think this is where the Renegade path completely falls flat and why so few people pursue it. If the outcome is the same, then you're just being a dick for no reason. There are very few points in any of the games where choosing the high road actually causes you problems. Generally, you just see more of the game this way. If you're a helpful sort of person in an RPG, that means you get more quests, which is the lifeblood of the genre and why you're here in the first place. There's almost never an advantage to being a renegade, so the ruthless and efficient angle doesn't really work. The vast majority of renegade dialogue in the game is just you being an asshole for no reason, aside from maybe someone thinks it's cooler to be a prick than to be a big softie. But it makes me feel a little better about humanity to know that 92% of people don't think that way. A full renegade shepherd is a very bristly, unlikable person, quick to anger, quick to violence, and quick to racism, at least in the first game. This does create a definitive character, which, as mentioned earlier, is what Mass Effect is trying to do, but Paragon Shepard is also a definitive character, a much more likeable and enjoyable one. There are a lot of bad and cynical people in Mass Effect, and I find it more satisfying and cathartic to take the high road and choose optimism in the face of that, rather than sink to their level. In many ways, a Paragon Shepherd is more stubborn than a Renegade one for clinging to their idealism in the face of a galaxy that refuses to match up to it, especially as you go into Mass Effect 2 and 3. It doesn't help that Paragon Shepherd is typically vindicated in a way that Renegade Shepherd isn't, but that's an issue probably better left for the discussions of the next games, particularly Mass Effect 3. One big issue with Mass Effect that a second playthrough exposes is that a lot of the dialogue choices are completely fake. Shepard will say the same thing no matter what you pick. If, like most people, you only ever play Paragon, you'd never notice, which is probably why it's never been a big controversy, but it is, at the very least, a little baffling. It was a big controversy when Mass Effect 3 came out that Shepard speaks often with no input from the player, but this is just the same thing with an added step. It's the illusion of choice at its most transparent, literally the meme with the hallways that all lead to the same room. So instead of maintaining the illusion, Mass Effect 3 just knocked down the other hallways. The dialogue done this way is typically filler dialogue anyway, the stuff that you need to keep a conversation flowing, but that doesn't really contribute to characterization. So I don't mind that the future games don't feel the need to give you control over every line of dialogue like this game does. To me, it's an extension of what the games are always trying to do. Save the choices for the key moments and leave Shepard to be their own person. It's hard to find any developers talking about this issue, so I assume that this was some sort of time or budget constraint. It's hardly the only part of the game that feels a little unfinished. After exposing Saren and leaving the Citadel with a mission to go find him, Mass Effect 1 is entirely open-ended until the very last mission. You have a few leads to follow, but you can pursue them in any order, and outside of the main quest there's a whole quadrant of the galaxy to get out there and explore. Openness sounds good, but it's not always a strength. There's a good reason that Mass Effect 2 pivoted to a much more curated design. There's about 4 dozen star systems you can explore, and within each system is typically either a planet you can land on or a ship you can board. While the main quest planets are all highly polished and full of detail, all of these side locations are extremely bare bones. The uncharted worlds are intensely formulaic to the point of being transparently artificial. Each world is the same terrain with a different colour applied to it in a different skybox. There will always be at least one minor collectible, one or two mineral deposits to tag, and at least one structure that ties into a side quest. For these structures, there is one kind of warehouse, one kind of abandoned mineshaft, one kind of underground facility, and one kind of spaceship. And you will get used to all of these template structures very quickly. Dragon Age 2 gets the most shit for repetitiveness, and with good reason, but Mass Effect 1 is not lagging that far behind. Driving across these worlds in the Mako, your tank/Mars rover, does have a feeling of authentic space exploration to it. This is what most planets in the galaxy probably look like: hostile, lifeless balls of rock. It's evocative, but not very interesting. It's one of the places where you can see the seams of Mass Effect at their most exposed. The Legendary Edition's facelift does a lot to hide those seams, but it can't hide them completely. Mass Effect, as you've no doubt gathered by now, was a very ambitious game even for a well-seasoned studio like BioWare. But corners were cut and crunch was at a maximum. In Tech Radar's oral history of the game's production, lead audio designer Steve Sim describes the game's production as a death march. He also goes on to say that his first day working on Mass Effect 2 was his last day working at BioWare. He couldn't bear to do it again, and he took up a job trimming grass on a golf course instead. The Legendary Edition hides a lot of this crunchy quality of Mass Effect 1. For 2 and 3, the Legendary Edition is mostly just a remaster with a few bug fixes. But for Mass Effect 1, it makes a ton of changes. Bug fixes, yes, but also changing the entire feel of combat, driving, the UI, and a lot of the visuals have been updated to bring them more in line with the later games. In some aspects with the new visuals and gameplay, Mass Effect 1 now looks and feels a little better than Mass Effect 2 does. Maybe if you're nostalgic for the old days of terrible graphical pop-up, game-breaking glitches and floaty combat, you should go back to the original. But I think for most people the Legendary Edition is the definitive way to play. I have no doubt that the Legendary team would have added more structures to the Uncharted worlds if they had infinite time and money, but it was probably considered not worthwhile for content that a lot of players never bother with. Mass Effect 1's gameplay is best described as fine. The Legendary Edition's reworks bring it up to the level of almost fun, but never quite crossing into that threshold of being actually fun. The original game had exceptionally floaty combat, and a lot of the shooting mechanics were heavily tied to your skill points. If you weren't trained in sniper rifles, they were useless to you because shots would miss even if your aim was dead on. This left good old spray and pray as the most valuable tactic in any given situation. The Legendary Edition sharpens it all up and brings it more in line with Mass Effect 2 and 3, making it feel much more like a third-person shooter than the original ever did. But it's still not really a selling point of the game in the way the sleek combat of Mass Effect 3 is. Often, what fun there is to be had in Mass Effect 1's combat is in the jank. Among the combat classes you can choose from in the beginning are several biotic classes. Biotics are a kind of telekinesis that people sometimes gain after exposure to the universe's magic space fuel element Zero. You can use these powers to ragdoll enemies about the place in a way that is quite amusing, much more amusing than just pointing your gun at them and holding down the trigger until they die. This also holds true of the Mako. It's weird and floaty to drive even in the Legendary Edition, and it also comes as standard, for some reason, with vertical thrusters that shoot you directly into the air. This is never useful, but it is pretty funny if you're in the mood for a bit of slapstick. Combat just isn't as important in Mass Effect 1 as it is to the later games. Mass Effect 2 is definitively an action RPG with the action part front and centre. Mass Effect 1 feels like a much more traditional title. It's clearly trying to pivot in that direction, but it just can't let go of a lot of those old RPG habits, like an extensive loot system. Mass Effect's looting mechanics are infamously terrible, and I'm not about to disagree. There's a huge pile of different armors and guns in the game that all amount to nothing more than a colour change and some higher number values. It feels exceptionally redundant, and actually works against the story the game is going for. You're supposed to be a Spectre, the top-level enforcers of the galactic government with access to all of the resources and equipment you need to accomplish your task. Yet, in any given playthrough, you're probably going to spend hours rummaging through storage lockers looking for a slightly better pistol. This also means that you end up with a backpack full of completely worthless crap. You can't just ignore it either, you need to be constantly scavenging for better gear to keep up with the power curve of the enemies. But since the enemies scale at the same rate as you, there is absolutely no feeling of escalating power. Combat feels exactly the same on Eden Prime as it does in the finale. It's not the point of the game. The story is the point of the game. The repeating locations are quite annoying, but the stories you encounter there are typically worth doing, and serve to expand your understanding of the setting. Most of the game takes place in the Attican Traverse, an area on the borders of Citadel space which humans have been aggressively colonising. The reason the Council hadn't been colonising the Traverse is that it's a particularly dangerous region. Colonies out here are at high risk of pirate raids and other hostility while being too far away to call for help. This also makes it a good place for miscreants and ne'er-do-wells to hide out. You can skip this entire side of the game and the experience will be largely unchanged, but you miss out on a lot of the smaller threads and connections to future games if you do. Some of these side missions will be related to your chosen backstory for Shepard, some of them will tie back into threads from the main story, and most curiously, some of them tie directly into the games to come. One example is a mission on Earth's moon to deal with a rogue virtual intelligence. The mission is a bit boring, just 3 identical bunkers full of basic combat drones, but as it goes on it hits a strangely melancholy note. The VI doesn't speak, but it sure does try to stop you from killing it. You have to methodically destroy each server one at a time, and as you do, the VI will get more and more desperate and activate more and more defences. When you shut down the last server, you get a panicked final message from the VI in binary. Help. It's not confirmed until Mass Effect 3, but this quest is the origin story for a very important character in the next game. A connection only made if you decide to do this very tangential side mission when Hackett asks you to. Several other quests revolve around a rogue human splinter group called Cerberus, conducting strange experiments and having a hand in manipulating the events of the main story from the shadows. They're only ever discussed in the margins here in Mass Effect 1, but by Mass Effect 2 they'll be one of the most important organisations in the series. In the main story, the Geth impale the bodies of fallen enemies on spikes and turn them into these strange robotic zombies called husks. But you can actually find a bunch of husks throughout the game on planets that the Geth have never been to, always around some strange piece of alien technology that the colonists uncovered. A detail which reveals twists that won't be fully explained until much later on in Mass Effect 2, but the clues are all here if you're looking for them. That colony, however, is 3 identical warehouses in a field, so in a lot of these cases your imagination and curiosity has to guide these encounters much more than the world design, which I suppose is another carryover from the RPGs of old. There's a couple examples of what could have been for the Uncharted worlds found in the main story and the DLC. The mission that you're heavily suggested to do first is track down Dr. Liara Tassoni, the daughter of Benezia, because the UI makes it pretty clear that she's your last companion. Her dig site is on any one of 4 worlds in a particular star cluster, so this is also the game introducing you to space exploration and Uncharted worlds. Therum, the planet where you find her, has by far the least narrative content out of any of the main quests. It's a simple in-and-out rescue mission for the Doctor, mostly in the Mako. But it's a cool volcanic planet with some more natural-looking structures and a more linear layout. If this was the standard for the Uncharted worlds, it probably would have been a much more beloved feature, but also, of course, a lot more work. The other example is the first DLC pack, Bring Down the Sky. Compared to future games, and especially compared to the immense amount of DLC that Dragon Age Origins received, Mass Effect's DLC showings are quite humble. Bring Down the Sky sends you to asteroid X-57, which is on a collision course with Terra Nova, the largest human settlement outside of Earth. Visually and mechanically, X-57 functions exactly like all the Uncharted worlds. It even reuses those bloody warehouses again. But it has an overarching plot, some cool new lore, and it's a more interesting setting than just some random planet. The colonists were going to mine out the asteroid for resources and then turn it into an orbital station for the planet, hence the jet boosters. But the asteroid was hijacked by a group of Batarian terrorists. Batarians are a very underutilised part of the lore. They feature in the majority of Shepard's backstories as well as being very important in the prequel novel, but they don't show up physically until this DLC. Batarians are humanity's main rivals much more than the Turians. When humanity joined the galactic community, they were granted a lot of colony space that was supposed to be marked for the Batarians. But the Council clearly preferred humanity to Batarians, most likely because while we have our flaws, the Human System Alliance is a much more civil and democratic system than the Batarian hegemony. Some kind of authoritarian system that practices slavery. This dismissal led to the Batarians closing their embassy and shutting their borders to all outsiders. At the same time, they started a proxy war with humanity via various criminal factions, resulting in at least 2 of the 3 backstory events Shepard can be a part of. The games never really expand on the Batarians more than that, which is unfortunate because it is an interesting setup. Balak, the villain of Bring Down the Sky, is still one of the most well-developed Batarians in the series. He's a political extremist and a terrorist, but if you press him on a renegade run, it's clear that this is a sanctioned mission. He's just too loyal to admit that. Like a lot of political extremists, he's perfectly happy to highlight the atrocities of his enemies while ignoring the atrocities of his own people. The Ruthless backstory has Shepard be a part of the Siege of Torfin, an exceptionally bloody affair where Shepard got 2/3 of their squad killed to ensure that not a single Batarian was left standing in the camp. These events always happened regardless of which backstory you choose, but there is extra resonance in these moments if you happen to align with them. Balak calls out humanity, or Shepard specifically, for their brutality that day, conveniently ignoring that it was a slaver camp. Another of Shepard's backstory options, Colonist, has Shepard's entire family kidnapped by Batarian slavers when they were a child. Balak needs to be stopped, but his motivations and resentment are understandable and well thought out. It's just a shame that this conflict never really goes anywhere in the sequels. Balak does, however, present one of the best Paragon Renegade choices in the game. When you reach him in the main facility, thankfully a custom bespoke building for a change, he's planted bombs which will kill his hostages if you try and stop him from escaping. The Paragon thing to do is to let him go while you deactivate the bombs. The Renegade thing to do is call his bluff and let him detonate the bombs to make sure he doesn't escape. It's one of the few times where the needs of the many ends justify the means attitude of a Renegade Shepard is an equally valid response. Don't negotiate with terrorists. Yes, 5 or 6 innocent people will die, but otherwise an extremely dangerous terrorist escapes to terrorize another day. Bring Down the Sky has a similar structure to a lot of the Uncharted World missions, just with the extra polish required to make it a truly compelling side quest. I'd still hesitate to say it's actually worth paying for, but it's extremely unlikely you would have to do that because like all of the DLC, it comes bundled with the Legendary Edition. Well, all but one. Pinnacle Station was the second DLC pack. Unlike Bring Down the Sky, which was developed in-house by BioWare, Pinnacle Station was developed by an external team, Demiurge Studios. Apparently, when it came time to develop the Legendary Edition, BioWare realised they didn't have the source code for Pinnacle Station, and when they reached out to Demiurge, all of their code had some sort of corruption issue that would have taken at least 6 months to work around. They decided it wasn't worth the time. And they were correct, because Pinnacle Station sucked. If you're a real completionist, you can always boot up the original Mass Effect and give it a go, and doing so really gives you a taste of how much better the Legendary Edition looks and feels, but Pinnacle Station is not worth the effort. Pinnacle Station is a combat simulator. You go through a series of challenges and scenarios against simulated enemies in environments very clearly reused from the base game. Since combat in Mass Effect 1 is not fun, or interesting, or a selling point, conceptually this expansion is very strange. There's no role-playing in Pinnacle Station. There's a tiny plot where you have to beat this jock Roturian scores and all the challenges to prove your worthiness as a warrior, and in the end you'll be gifted a fancy apartment and a computer that you can buy equipment from. Other than that, there are no rewards from the simulations, not even XP. Even as a pure gameplay experience, it's just not very good. Some of the challenges are piss easy and some of them are almost impossible. Kotaku's review at the time compared it to Star Trek Kobayashi Maru, a simulation designed to be impossible and that you have to break in order to win. I've done this exactly 1 time, because I do have the achievement for beating it, but I have no memory of doing it. I've long since lost the save I did it on, and I simply cannot be arsed doing it again to get 10 seconds of footage of an apartment. I promise you, whatever you're imagining is nicer than what you actually get. What makes Pinnacle Station even more baffling is that it was released 1.5 years after the game. It's closer to the release of Mass Effect 2 than it is to Mass Effect 1. I can only imagine how people felt returning to Mass Effect 17 months later for a DLC with no story content and mechanical content that's much better placed in the middle of the game, if you can be bothered to do it at all. And that's why you'd have to be an extreme purist or completionist to truly mourn the loss of Pinnacle Station. Even amongst hardcore fans, the loss of Pinnacle Station was mostly met with a passive shrug. If anything, removing the DLC only makes the game better. If you really want an endless combat simulator, there's one in Mass Effect 3, and at least Mass Effect 3's combat is fun. The true meat of the Mass Effect experience is the three main quests that make up the middle chunk of the game: Feros, Novaria, and Vermeer. The simplest, but by no means worst of these, is Feros. Feros is a small human colony that's been invaded by the Geth for unknown reasons. As soon as you arrive, though, it's clear that something weird is going on. The colonists are all behaving slightly off, and if you try to ask them anything about the colony, all they'll ever tell you is that you should talk to Faidan about that, the colony's de facto leader. It takes leaving and coming back for the twist to be revealed. The entire colony is under the influence of an ancient sentient plant creature called the Thorian, which can use its spores to control people's minds. It's a strange, fascinating, and on your first time through, thoroughly unexpected twist. But, looking back, Feros is a microcosm of the greater conflict of Mass Effect, foreshadowing for the larger twists of the series. The one problem with Feros is that it contains one of the worst Paragon Renegade choices in the series. Once you learn that the colonists are under mind control of an evil plant, the Paragon thing to do is to use special gas grenades to neutralize the colonists without killing them. The Renegade path is to say screw that and just murder them all. Even under the Renegade mindset, there is no justifiable reason to do this. You can't even view it as a purely efficient course of action because it's actually easier to use the grenades than to shoot them. The game knows this too. You have to refuse to use the grenades no less than 4 times before your companions will agree to shoot the innocent colonists, and even then it's pretty reluctantly. The scenario is perfectly fun as a Paragon because it makes choosing good an active part of the firefight. You have to watch your shots and especially any area of effect abilities. The game clearly wants this tension in the firefight. Killing any of the colonists is supposed to be an accident, and if you're happy to go along with that, it's a memorable sequence. If you don't go along with that, then we're back to just being an asshole for no reason. Even if you justify it as the colonists being too far gone, that's instantly proven wrong because they all go back to normal after the Thorian is killed, and even show up again in future games. A clear case where a Paragon Shepherd is vindicated in their actions. Funnily enough, the 2 morality missions in the game play on this exact dynamic. Once you reach 80% on either the Paragon or Renegade scale, Hackett will contact you with a unique mission. For Paragons, this is a very difficult mission to take down a group of biotic terrorists who are using drugged-up scientists as human shields. The Renegade mission is much funnier. Hackett sends you in to conduct peace negotiations with a pirate lord. The existence of these missions is the best feedback the game gives about a Paragon or Renegade playthrough. It is technically possible to see both on a single run, but you have to be really exploiting the system to pull that off. Hackett only assigns each mission to a shepherd who's suited to it. The Paragon mission is an impossible situation that Hackett only trusts Shepard with because Shepard has repeatedly demonstrated a desire to save lives at all costs, and has the skills to pull off a daring feat like this. On the other hand, Hackett sends a renegade Shepard on this peace negotiation because Shepard has repeatedly shown a shoot first, ask questions never attitude. And that's exactly what Hackett wants and expects Shepard to do. Lord Darius was a part of the Alliance's proxy war against the Batarians. They sent him weapons and equipment to use against them. But now he's become more trouble than he's worth and Hackett needs him dealt with. The peace negotiations are a sham, just a legal cover for what's clearly an assassination. If you actually do negotiate a peace agreement which involves agreeing to a series of escalatingly ridiculous and embarrassing concessions, then Hackett is clearly annoyed but can't say anything because technically you did do what he asked you to do. The Renegade mission is undoubtedly more interesting than the Paragon one. The Paragon mission doesn't even have a plot. I wouldn't say it justifies shooting all the Feros colonists to see it, but it's an interesting consequence of being the sort of person who would. Even as a murderous sociopath, Hackett knows how to point you in the right direction. A mission he would never dare send Paragon Shepard on. It reveals as much about Hackett as it does about Shepard. He's a minor player in Mass Effect 1, never even showing up in person. But by Mass Effect 3, he's one of the most important people in the galaxy. In contrast to Feros, the highlights of the Paragon-Renegade dynamic are on Novaria. Novaria is the longest quest in the game because it's split into 2 distinct parts. Novaria is a big ball of ice ruled over by a bunch of shady corporations. It's a place they can conduct their less-than-legal experiments without the oversight of the Citadel. You're here because Saren has a business investment on Novaria, but when you arrive, you quickly learn that Matriarch Benezia is here in person at a research facility out in the mountains. That's the second half of the mission. The first half is getting out of the port you land in because the administrator refuses to give you a pass to leave. Getting a pass to leave the port is the most open-ended quest in the whole series. There is a wide variety of completely valid ways you can get the pass, which all land somewhere on the Paragon Renegade spectrum. You can blackmail the port administrator, you can work with an internal affairs agent to get him fired for insider trading, you can expose a smuggler to trade your way to the pass, or you can tell the administrator about the internal affairs agent and have them kill each other in a Shakespearean tragedy, at which point you can just nick the pass off his body real quick. This kind of expressive player freedom is what a lot of people crave from RPGs, and it's an experience that's often very difficult to find because writing something this complex with so many different moving pieces is difficult, time-consuming, and costly. The practical truth is that if every quest in the game was designed like this, then the game would probably never come out, and personally, it's not what I find to be the true draw of Mass Effect anyway. It would be nice, but not essential, which is why this kind of open design was cut in the transition to Mass Effect 2. The second half of Novaria is much more in line with the quest structure of Mass Effect 2. The Peak 15 research facility is on lockdown after an army of hostile alien creatures escaped from the Hot Labs. You can mix up the order you do some things in, which can slightly impact the story, but the design is a series of linear hallways which lead to a confrontation with the big boss and a big decision to make, which is the structure of most of the quests in Mass Effect 2. The hostile creatures are Rachni, a race of sentient telepathic bugs that waged war on the galaxy 2,000 years ago, but they were eventually hunted to extinction. The scientists found an egg on an old Rachni ship and managed to revive it, but shockingly this brilliant plan of theirs went wrong. They wanted to breed the Rachni as an army, but being separated from the Queen at birth drives all the Rachni drones insane. They're just mindless, crazed animals. The children have to die, but the mother, the Queen, still has her senses, and she pleads for her life. Killing or sparing the Rachni Queen is one of the most infamous choices in the game because of how it affects, or more accurately how it doesn't affect Mass Effect 3. Limited to just Mass Effect 1, it's still one of the more interesting Paragon Renegade splits. Killing the Queen means returning the Rachni to extinction, but at one time they were a threat to the whole universe. They did not negotiate, nor did they try to. They were bloodthirsty killers. This queen says she's different, that she desires only to live in peace in a remote world somewhere. But she's also a giant bug monster. Can you really trust the giant bug monster who speaks through corpses? If you're playing Renegade, then obviously sparing her is not worth the risk. And if you're playing Paragon, then obviously sparing her is worth the risk. Once more, Paragon Shepherd is vindicated here, but let's not beat that broken record horse. I'm almost an hour into this video and I've barely done more than mention the companions, which is odd because companions are core to Mass Effect's identity and even more so BioWare's identity as a studio. The thing is, that identity really starts with Mass Effect 2. Everything about Mass Effect 2, from foundations upwards, is built around the expansive cast of interesting and varied companions. They define the tone and the structure of almost every mission in the game. Mass Effect 1 is not built this way, it's built like the older generation of RPGs. Your companions are the supporting cast, not the main characters. They're there to provide commentary and fire support, not drive the story forward. That's not to say they're bad or boring characters, far from it. Mass Effect 1 has an excellent cast of companions. They're just not as important to the game as they will be in games to come. A lot of Mass Effect 1's companion dialogue is utilitarian and written in a mathematical way. Each of the 6 companions sits somewhere on the Paragon Renegade spectrum. Kaidan, the human biotic, sits the furthest towards the Paragon side, and Rex, the Krogan bounty hunter, sits furthest towards the Renegade side. This spectrum is used to determine who says what dialogue in any given situation. For example, when talking to the Rachni Queen, one of your companions will always advocate for killing the Queen, and one will always advocate for sparing it. An angel and a devil on your shoulder. Mathematically and tactically, you will usually have one Paragon and one Renegade companion on your squad. But if you happen to bring along 2 Paragons or 2 Renegades, then you can hear the companions advocate for positions they would otherwise be arguing against, because the other companion has a higher Renegade score than they do. This system robs the companions of some of their agency in favour of the player. Their opinions are fluid. You can hear them argue for things they previously disagreed with just because you brought someone else with you. Sometimes that fluidity is intentional, but mostly it's just kind of annoying. The best example of it being intentional is your Turian companion, Garrus Vakarian. Garrus is a cop, the investigator in charge of the Sarin case for Citadel security, or CSEC for short. He doesn't manage to find anything because of all the red tape, so decides to join your mission where he feels he can do more good working outside of the system rather than within it. In Mass Effect 2 onwards, Garrus is very heavily characterised by banter, but he doesn't actually have much banter here in the first game. It's the Paragon-Renegade split that's the core of his character. Garrus wants to be a good cop. He wants to help people, he wants to catch the bad guys, but he also has a ruthless streak. He hates bureaucracy, he's not too fussed about ethics, and he believes in doing what needs to be done to finish the job. Shepard acts as a mentor for Garrus, either chastising these impulses as a Paragon or encouraging these impulses as a renegade. If you push him towards the Paragon path, then his place on the spectrum will shift and Garrus will be more likely to argue for Paragon positions. He'll also say he plans to return to CSEC when the mission is over and work within the system to try and make a difference. If you push him renegade, he'll instead talk about how he plans to pursue Spectre training and become a rogue like you. Garrus is an interesting window into Turian culture because he's not actually a very good Turian by Turian standards. The Turians are a militaristic people of order and procedure. They're not just by the book, they wrote most of the books. Like all the other races, these stereotypes have some level of truth, but as Garrus proves, they're not always true. Some Turians are just as reckless and disorderly as the rest of the galaxy. On the flip side of the spectrum from Garrus would have to be Talizora Naraya, the young and naive Quarian engineer. Tali is the only Quarian in the game, although her people still play a background role as it was the Quarians who created the Geth 300 years ago. Quarians are one of the most complicated races in the series. They created the Geth as automated servants, but the Geth eventually rebelled, killing most of the Quarian people and driving the remaining survivors to evacuate their homeworld with a fraction of the numbers they once had. The Quarians now travel the galaxy as the Migrant Fleet, wandering aimlessly and trying to survive, unable to colonize a new world because their physiology is only suited to their homeworld of Rannoch. Rannoch had no diseases or pathogens, so the entire species is permanently immunocompromised and have to wear envirosuits when dealing with any other races or planets. A situation which makes colonizing new worlds extremely difficult. They're also, because of their role in creating the Geth, outcasts from galactic civilization. It was 300 years ago, sure, but in the lifetime of an Asari, that's still pretty recent. Tali is out on her pilgrimage, a rite of passage into adulthood, where a young Quarian must leave the fleet and only return when they have found something of value to bring back. Tali is my least favourite companion in Mass Effect 1, which is strange to say because she's one of my favourite characters overall in the trilogy. It's just that as a character, she doesn't really come into her own until Mass Effect 2. She's an absolute font of information and lore about the Quarians and the Geth, but as the most inexperienced and youngest member of the team, she often has the least interesting feedback in any situation. That's because, more than the others, the plot of Mass Effect is Tali's backstory. It's where she learns a lot of the confidence and independence she has in Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect was planned from the very beginning as a trilogy, even if they hadn't mapped out where the story was going yet. And Tali feels more than any of the other companions like a seed that's intended to fully sprout later on. Even a lot of her backstory discussions feel more like setup for her story in Mass Effect 2 than anything going on in Mass Effect 1. Like introducing the idea that she's an admiral's daughter with a lot of pressure and expectation on her shoulders, or the argument you can get into her about how justified the Quarian's response to the Geth gaining sentience really was. Both story threads that Mass Effect 2 takes and runs with. My favourite companion is by no coincidence also the most consistent companion. Urdnot Rex is at the very top of the Renegade hierarchy, and so he will always advocate for the Renegade options regardless of who's with him. Outside of some extremely rare dialogue you have to be really trying to hear. Rex is a bitter, sarcastic old merc with scars that run a lot deeper than the ones on his face. He has a lot of great lines, but moreover, Rex is the best example of what Renegade can look like as a philosophy if you balance it right. Rex is pragmatic much more than he's cruel. He looks big and scary, but he's not actually a bad guy. He has a moral centre that's not immediately apparent upon first meeting him. The Krogan are a take on another classic sci-fi trope, the proud warrior race. Everything about them is built for battle. They have natural plate armour, redundant organs and nervous systems. They're exceptionally big and strong. They store nutrients in their back humps like camels so they can keep fighting without needing to eat or drink for long periods of time. And they also live for millennia. The game never gives his exact age, but considering some of the events he talks about, Rex is at least 1,000 years old. I think only Drac in Andromeda canonically has him beat, and Drac is also a Krogan. What makes the Krogan an interesting take on the warrior race is that, like the Asari, they serve as a deconstruction of the old tropes, asking, then what, and then taking the warriors to their logical endpoint, and a lot of that is explored through Rex. The Krogan were never supposed to make it to space. 2,000 years ago, they were barely surviving a self-inflicted nuclear winter on their home planet, as is the obvious endpoint of any culture that glorifies violence and bloodshed above all else. However, at that time, the Rachni were ravaging through the galaxy, and the Council, at the time just the Asari and Solarians, needed an army who could fight them, and they figured the Krogan would make the perfect soldiers. They uplifted the Krogan, gave them ships, guns, and armour, and then pointed them straight at the Rachni. They were highly effective, but they didn't stop fighting and expanding just because the Rachni were defeated. And a few hundred years later, the Krogan were becoming just as much of a threat as the Rachni were. An interesting wrinkle that Mass Effect adds to the Krogan is that because they evolved in an extremely hostile world, Krogan reproduce extremely quickly, having hundreds of children at a time because in their own environment, most of them don't live very long. This was the real problem during what's now called the Krogan Rebellion. It's not just that they're extremely tough, but that their population was growing at an exponential rate. So, some Solarian scientists came up with a truly devious solution: the genophage, a genetic virus that rendered all Krogan almost completely sterile. This ended the rebellions because when 99% of your children are stillborn, fighting a war seems like a much less pressing concern. And moreover, what little of a Krogan government there was quickly fell apart as the various Krogan clans fought to survive. The Krogan you meet in the game are broken, fragmented people, most of them wasting away their lives as mercenaries hoping for a good battle to die in. The whole affair is wonderfully complex. Ultimately, a lot of the blame does lie with the Council. Starfleet has a prime directive for a reason. The Krogan were not ready for space. If they ever would be, it would not be for thousands of years at least. But they needed a quick solution to the Rachni problem, and that created a new cascading problem for them later. But it's also clearly a cultural problem with the Krogan themselves. Cultures based on endless war are fundamentally flawed. If you're going to insist on fighting everyone forever, then eventually you're going to die. Quickly or slowly, it's going to happen. This is what makes Rex such a compelling character. He plays the part of a big tough Krogan merc well enough, but he's a hell of a lot wiser than he initially lets on. Rex was, once upon a time, an idealist. He understood the problems with his society and the reasons everything had gone wrong, and he understood that the only way they could survive as a species was to fundamentally change their culture. They would have to drop the guns and focus on rebuilding, stop acting like savages and start acting like real warriors, noble, purposeful, and disciplined. He failed. His own father, a bitter, jaded warlord of the Rachni Wars, wanted nothing more than the endless battle and bloodshed. He had learned nothing from the genophage and tried to kill his own son for his revolutionary ideas. The event shattered Rex's optimism. Everyone who agreed with him was dead, and everyone left was a mindless, bloodthirsty idiot. So he gave up on his people, decided there was nothing he could do to save them, and that if you can't beat him, join him. So, he signed up as a mercenary, just looking for a good battle to die in. Such is how you meet him at the start of the game, but he sees a change in the wind. He can sense that Saren represents a different kind of threat, and so he joins up with you. No charge, because he wants to fight for something more than credits for a change. Playing as a Paragon Shepherd throughout the trilogy reflects a great character arc for Rex, where your optimism and idealism reignites his own and he starts to begin again, armed this time with the wisdom of a few hundred years. It's certainly a lot more satisfying than the pure renegade path where you just blow his brains out. A few months after the release of the Legendary Edition, BioWare released a stat sheet of some of the major choices throughout the trilogy, and the least surprising stat on that list is that only 6% of players kill Rex on Vermeer, because who in their right mind would actually kill Rex? I'm sure the stats were slightly higher on the original release, but anyone playing the Legendary Edition knows that you don't kill Rex, because Rex rules. I think it's to the credit of the trilogy that you can kill Rex that the trilogy will let you make such a stupid mistake and live with the consequences all the way up to Mass Effect 3, but you're just giving yourself an inferior experience doing it that way. Vermeer is the best chapter of Mass Effect 1 because it offers not one, but two of these trilogy-altering choices, as well as being the place where the primary conflict of the trilogy is first revealed. Saren has a base on Vermeer, a base where, among other things, he's breeding an army of Krogan. Shepard and the Solarian Special Forces obviously want to blow the place up, but Rex voices his objections. This is, after all, a cure, or at least a workaround to the genophage. His people need this. It's the only time in the game that a companion comes into proper ideological conflict with the events of the story, not just voicing a complaint, but acting on it. If you've gotten to know Rex and understand his position well enough, then you can talk him down, especially if you previously gained his trust by helping him with a small personal quest to reclaim some old family armour. Saren is not an ally to the Krogan people. His cure is subjugation, and that's not actually a future Rex wants, even if he does want a cure. If you can't convince him, or choose not to try, then you'll be forced to kill him. And that's the worst outcome, because it's not with Saren's research that hope for the Krogan dies, but with Rex himself. Probably the most fleshed out companions, and definitely the two with the most dialogue, are also the two that most people consider the least interesting: Kaidan Alenko and Ashley Williams. I've actually made whole videos about Kaidan and Ashley a couple of years ago because I find them both quite underrated characters for very different reasons, but it's worth going over them again. Kaidan and Ashley are dealt a bad hand by the setup of the game. They're the boring humans in a world of weird and wonderful aliens. They're also very heavily pushed as romantic partners for a shepherd of the opposite sex. BioWare was severely underestimating its audience's tastes with Mass Effect 1, a mistake they would never repeat again. Kaidan and Ashley are also almost always talked about as a pair because of the major choice that happens on Virmire not even 40 minutes after your confrontation with Rex. The party is split up, both Ashley and Kaidan are under attack, and you have to choose who lives and who dies. There's no Paragon Renegade moralizing over this one, just the choice and the consequences. The Virmire choice is an excellent moment, but it also often undermines the genuinely good character work that's done with both of them. Ashley is a soldier through and through, bringing the same kind of bravado and kick-ass attitude of any Marine from an 80s action movie. Just as the alien companions serve as windows into alien cultures, Ashley serves as the window into human culture. How are we doing in the 22nd century? As a renegade, Ashley typically voices alien skeptical attitudes, bordering on or sometimes crossing into racist territory. An attitude built on her general inexperience in dealing with aliens and, more importantly, wrapped up in her own baggage. Ashley's grandfather was a general during the First Contact War, the only general to ever surrender to an alien force. Since then, her family has been blacklisted and always given the crappy middle-of-nowhere assignments like Eden Prime. Rather than place her anger about that on the obvious shittiness of military higher-ups for something her grandfather did 30 years ago, Ashley displaces the outrage towards the aliens. It was the aliens who brought shame on her family for attacking in the first place. That being said, her attitude towards aliens is not uncommon. She's a useful and interesting perspective to have on the team, especially if you play Paragon and clash with her skepticism. It's technically possible to turn Ashley Paragon like you can with Garrus, however you can only do this if you're romancing her with a Paragon male shepherd. And this limitation on the change is a bit strange because it logs what feels like important character progression behind an optional dialogue choice in an optional romantic subplot. She'll only stop being racist if you smooch her real good, although I suppose that's still better than using your kisses to turn Kaidan into a racist. Kaidan is a much worse example of the awkward and annoying way that romance is written in Mass Effect 1. Kaidan is the game's window into biotics. Biotics are fairly common in the wider galaxy, but human biotics are a relatively new phenomenon. Kaidan is among the first generation. If Shepard is a biotic, then they're fitted with a modern L3 implant. The earlier biotics were fitted with the much more unstable L2 implants. The L2s can spike higher in terms of power output, but with a wide variety of side effects. Kaidan is one of the lucky ones, he just gets bad headaches. But an important detail of a lot of the Uncharted missions is that most L2s are completely insane. They're out joining cults, kidnapping politicians, and killing the crews of entire ships to protect people who are already dead. While I already confessed to the basic opinion that Rex is my favourite companion, my spiciest take is that Kaidan is a close second, because Kaidan is a fascinating example of what positive masculinity looks like in a world of violence. Kaidan is a nice guy. He's respectful, honest, open-minded, but also a little introverted, soft-spoken and socially awkward. Often, especially in 2007, these traits are considered feminine-coded, not the sort of things a tough soldier like Kaidan should be embodying, but Mass Effect doesn't go in for that kind of machismo crap. It's a simple enough trick to flip the gender tropes between Ashley and Kaidan, but I think Kaidan takes the win in that trade because it makes him much more unique in a sea of big macho soldier dudes. This is all made much more clear if you romance him. If you're pursuing the romance, almost every single line of dialogue with Caden is different. Caden keeps himself very calm and collected most of the time, and the only time he lets himself be more loose and unwound is with a romancing shepherd, someone he feels comfortable around. Caden will reveal to either shepherd his backstory, how he accidentally killed his teacher in biotic training because he got angry seeing the teacher abusing another student. What only becomes clear to a romancing shepherd is how much that actually affected him, how afterwards he tried to suppress all his emotions, constantly keeping himself tightly wound for fear of what might happen if he lets himself be vulnerable again. Caden calls himself one of the lucky ones, but considering the condition of most other L2 biotics, it's clear that it's more than luck. His relentless self-control is a big part of what keeps him functioning day to day. With Shepard, he awakens some of that vulnerability. He finds himself more loose, more willing to joke around and be a little flirty. It works especially well with the contrast of how he normally acts if you're not romancing him, cool and professional. Romancing Shepard throws him off kilter and reawakens his humanity. The way this is coded into the game, though, is awkward. The game does not give you the option to say no to Caden. The romance starts from the beginning and will progress no matter what you say if you keep talking to him. Because of the quirks of his personality, the romance is written so that Shepard is always the one driving this forward. So it's not that Caden won't take a hint, it's that you keep uncontrollably dropping the hints. Also, as mentioned, if you're romancing Caden, then it is possible to turn him into a renegade, which in terms of character progression feels like a completely backward step for him. It's also got to be the rarest scene dialogue in the series because it requires you to play a renegade female shepherd who romances Caden, a percentage that gets smaller with every modifier added. It's one of those RPG choices that's maybe just better left ignored. The sequels certainly ignore it and will revert Caden back to his usual Paragon self come Mass Effect 2. According to some cut dialogue in the source code, it was apparently at one point going to be possible to save both Ashley and Caden, but the option was cut, and the game is much better for it, because the option to save both would render the options to save one or the other utterly toothless. The choice as it is has real bite. There's no wrong answer and a ton of right answers, especially with how it intertwines with a romance with either of them. But even with how the game kind of forces you down a romance with Ashley or Caden, you don't have to pursue either of them. There's always the wildcard third option. Liara T'Soni is arguably the most important companion in Mass Effect. Her importance to the series starts strong here and only gets stronger as the games go on. She has one of the most well-defined arcs across the 3 games too, starting here with the young and naive scientist you rescue on Therum. She's actually 106 years old, but within the lifetime of an Asari, this makes her pretty much a 20-year-old grad student. Liara makes a great window into Asari culture because of how much he contrasts with the stereotypes. Garrus may be a rogue cop, but he's still a cop, a perfectly Turian thing to do. Liara is a scientist. She has no interest in being a dancer or a wise counselor or a mother. All she wants to do is go to the middle of nowhere and dig out some ancient relics. She's not shy, she's just socially inept. She values the solitude of a dig site over the hustle and bustle of a city. She'll talk about her people and their biology, but from an outsider's perspective, it's things she'd never really considered pursuing herself. She has a cold, slightly disconnected attitude about a lot of things, even though she is still squarely on the Paragon side of the spectrum. You initially seek out Liara to learn more about her mother, but the truth is Liara doesn't know much more about her mother than you do. They haven't spoken for years and were never that close before that. Even taking Liara to the confrontation with Benezia isn't the big emotional spectacle you may expect. She handles her mother dying right in front of her shockingly well. Just a brief, fairly dry conversation about it and then she's ready to move on. This emotional disconnect is a subtle but key element of her character that becomes much more relevant when Mass Effect 2 rolls around. It's not that she doesn't care, she just views things much more coldly and logically than most people would. She's young by Asari standards, but she's still over 100 years old, and that's partly where this detachment comes from. It's a quality that several Asari in the series share, a requirement of the knowledge that you will outlive almost everyone you meet. The only way to break through that coldness, much like with Caden, is if you romance her. Liara is the most consistent romance you can have across all 3 games in the trilogy, and she's also available to both male and female shepherds. As you can imagine, for 2007 this stirred up quite a bit of controversy, although the controversy was almost as much about the nudity in these scenes as it was about the 2 girls kissing. A sex box game, as Fox News famously called it. suggesting that the game was exposing children to pornographic material, even though the game is and always has been 18+. But they were as stupid in 2007 as they are today, because even by the standards of 2007, the sex scenes are just not very erotic. The technology was far too limited to render actual physical intimacy in a way that doesn't look like two Barbie dolls smacking into each other. I don't mind their existence because I think there's a level of campy sexuality built into the core of Mass Effect. When you do a take on the sexy alien babes trope, you can't help but bring a bit of that campy tone with you. For example, the armour and uniforms for men and women are pretty drastically different in a way that modern games would probably not go for. Andromeda gives everyone the same uniforms, but the boob armour, as some critics might call it, is a part of the retro sci-fi look that the game is going for. The future games arguably take this too far, looking at you, Mass Effect 3 Ashley, but we'll get to that when we get to that. The heightened caricatureness of people is reflected in the men too. Absolutely all of them, even Joker, who has brittle bone disease, are absolute beefcakes. The dynamics there are different, of course. I can't really deny that the game has a very male-gazy perspective, because it's one of the only things, besides the gameplay, that truly makes Mass Effect feel dated. There is a legendarily awful scene with an Asari called Sha'ira the Consort. She's a therapist/prostitute/spiritual guide that asks for your help in dealing with a client who got a little too emotionally involved. As a cultural element, or even as a character, Sha'ira is not terrible. The Asari being more open with their sexuality is an interesting cultural choice. It's the way the game frames it that's such a weird mess. When you complete her quest, Sha'ira will give you an astrology reading of Shepard based on your chosen backstory. A gift of words, she calls it. But if you choose the "that's it" option on this pretty lackluster gift, then she will immediately jump your bones right in front of your two companions. It's unbelievably awkward. It's this bizarre transactional moment that comes out of nowhere and truly means nothing other than some sweet blue TNA. This happens if you're playing male or female Shepard, but it's pretty clear in this instance who the intended audience of a scene like this is. Liara is a much better written character than Shiara, but it's hard not to feel the same way about her romance sometimes. The way the game really highlights her virginity and youth feels annoyingly fetishistic, especially when her emotional detachment is the more interesting angle for the romance to take. In most cases, Mass Effect feels like it has a lot of respect for its female characters. Ashley, Liara, and Tali never feel like lesser characters than their male counterparts. It just never escapes the male as default principle. The male as default principle is an old-school feminist analysis that digs into the very heart of our patriarchal society. The basic theory is this: men are the standard, women are a deviation. This goes to the very beginning with the construction of the words. We have man, and we have woo-man. Male and female. It's a modification, a deviation on the male root word. Applied to Mass Effect, you can see this sort of thing all over the place, the most obvious being that there are no alien women. There are Asari, and there's Tali, but everyone else is a dude, even though almost all of the other aliens, Solarians, Turians, Krogan, are multi-gender species. It takes until Mass Effect 3 before we ever see a female Krogan or Solarian, until the DLC of Mass Effect 3 before we ever see a female Turian, and we've never seen female Batarians, Elcor, or Volus. When you're creating a fictional alien race, gender is an absolutely critical part of that discussion. A discussion that often feels half-finished within Mass Effect. This lack of women is explained sometimes. For the Krogan, the lack of any women makes sense because with the genophage, women become an extremely valuable resource, protected and controlled by the men. This is absolutely a sexist idea, but it's an in-universe sexist idea that's believable given the circumstances, and it's an angle that Mass Effect 3 eventually explores very well. Even still, I'm reminded of another sci-fi project from the same year, the Michael Bay Transformers movie. Originally, the famous pink and white lady transformer, RC, was supposed to appear in the movie, but she was cut because the producers didn't want to have to explain robot gender. Male robots are unnoteworthy, but female robots would have to be explained. So it goes for aliens too, it seems. Although on the other hand, you have the aliens with absolutely no explanation for the lack of women. Within the lore, Turians are a completely meritocratic society. They do not have sexism. All citizens, regardless of gender, go through mandatory military service. There is no in-universe reason why the Turians you see on the Citadel are not at least 50% women, the way the humans are. There's only the out-of-universe explanation that men are standard and women are a deviation. Mass Effect Andromeda makes big strides to correct this, including a Lady Turian companion and actual gender parity amongst all the aliens in the game. But that's a full decade away from where we are now in Mass Effect 1. This is not me saying that the game is sexist, although we shall certainly revisit that idea in the sequels. Male as default is a perspective born from unquestioned biases, not hatred. And Mass Effect does give you one way to pretty defiantly stand against it. You can play as a woman. FemShep is one of the most ironic feminist icons in gaming because becoming a feminist icon was a complete accident. FemShep is a product of the male as default perspective. Shepard is written from a default, aka male, perspective. Good old John Shepard is where the cursor starts in character creation, and once again, we have the words. We have Shepard, and we have FemShep. She is an aberration, although I think the name Broshep has more or less caught on these days. But this is where the accidental feminism starts. Because 95% of the dialogue is the same regardless of gender, FemShep becomes an exceptionally well-written female character, one that totally spits in the face of established gender norms and tropes. FemShep is treated with the same respect as her male counterpart. She is treated as a character and not as a female character. There are occasional dialogue differences, like a sleazeball ex-cop trying to hit on you, but with the Shepard standard established, Shepard reacts to this in character, either putting it down hard as a renegade or rising above it and ignoring it as a paragon. FemShep often comes across as a much stronger character than Broshep because where male Shepard's characterization is a little generic, it's much more unique and dynamic to see a woman with the same characterization. Part of that credit has to go to Jennifer Hale, a voice acting legend who brings a gravitas to Shepard that can actually match the likes of Keith David and Lance Henriksen. FemShep just feels vivid in a way that default John never quite matches up to. Shepard is unique amongst RPG protagonists for how much fan art there is of them, but the vast majority of that fan art is of FemShep, because fans of FemShep can't ever seem to shut up about FemShep, including me. One of the most popular videos I've ever made is about FemShep and how, in my opinion, she massively improves the Mass Effect experience. BioWare clearly did not understand how influential FemShep would be when they made Mass Effect 1. In the original release, FemShep didn't have a custom rendered face like Broshep did, just one of the starter models made with the creation tools. But by Mass Effect 3, they realised that FemShep had become a bit of a phenomenon and decided to change that. It was baby steps because their solution to this was, I kid you not, a beauty pageant on Facebook. The winner was a blonde babe, of course, but they made her hair red as a nod to the old default FemShep and added her to the game and a reversible cover on the box that had male Shepard on one side and then female Shepard on the other. The Legendary Edition takes this FemShep model and applies it retroactively to the first two games. Not only that, they made some subtle edits to the model as well. I never much cared for the original Mass Effect 3 FemShep design, mostly because she looks far too young. The Legendary Edition adds texture and detail to the face that makes her look a little older and a little less plasticky, and overall brings her more in line with good old Mark Vanderloo. I tend to think most games are more interesting to play as women when you're given the option, exactly because men are so often the default protagonists in action games. But there is no greater example than Shepard. The only major character left to discuss is your nemesis, Saren. Because you're following in his footsteps for most of the game, Saren is quite an absentee villain. Talked about more than talked to. But there is a good reason for that, and it comes just a few minutes before you finally meet him on the battlefield. Each chapter of the game, Feros, Noveria, and especially Vermeer, keep coming back to the idea of indoctrination. Saren has some sort of influence over people's minds. Not mind control, something more subtle. Something that makes you want to follow him and want to obey his every command, and even makes you think it's your own idea. During your confrontation with Benezia, she briefly breaks free from this control to try and explain it to you. Her actions are no longer her own, she has become a willing servant of Saren. She suggests that this power comes from his ship, Sovereign, an absolutely gigantic space squid-looking thing that you can see on Eden Prime. But something that becomes clear as you investigate is that Saren doesn't fully understand everything that's going on either. The Geth are following Saren because they believe that he is the herald of the Reapers, a race of sentient machines that killed the Protheans 50,000 years ago before vanishing. Saren is trying to bring them back, though his motivations for doing so remain unclear for most of the game. That is, until Vermeer. While he's growing Krogan on the second floor, on the first floor Saren is studying the effects of indoctrination, and what you find in his office recontextualizes the rest of the series. Sovereign is not a Reaper ship. Sovereign is a Reaper. The conversation with Sovereign is a standout moment of the series. It's like trying to talk to an actual god. It's unknowable, beyond your comprehension, and it will not humour your attempts to understand it. Saren was never your nemesis. Saren is the pawn of an ancient godlike machine. It will summon the rest of its kind and destroy all life in the universe, just as they did to the Protheans, and just as they did to every single race that came before the Protheans, a cycle repeated since the dawn of time. This is the true nature of the universe. Civilizations rise, they fall, they are harvested, and then the cycle begins again. The cycle will not be broken, and this cycle has just about run its course. There is a true feeling of urgency after this discussion. Saren is a threat you can stop with bullets, but Sovereign is 5 times the size of any ship in the galaxy and more advanced by far. An army of Reapers would mean certain doom for everyone, and in a frustratingly sympathetic position, nobody believes you. Shepard and their crew are the only people who've seen direct evidence of the Reapers. The beacon which gave Shepard their visions was a warning about the Reapers sent out across the Prothean Empire, but it was destroyed after Shepard used it. To everyone else, Shepard is a raving lunatic going on about a mythical doomsday scenario they saw in their dreams. It's a sympathetic frustration built between player and protagonist that Mass Effect 2 is especially good at driving home, before the least cathartic I told you so ever in Mass Effect 3. The only other person who truly understands you is your nemesis, Saren. Saren may be an absentee villain for most of the game, but he brings it where it counts. He's a tremendously complex villain for what's clearly the most evil-looking Turian in existence. Saren has a plan. He too has seen the visions of the Reapers. He knows what's coming. And he believes that fighting is a lost cause. The only way to make sure organic life survives is to make themselves useful to the Reapers. Willing and able servants. You can see how Saren might arrive at this conclusion and how he could trick himself into thinking he was the hero in this scenario. A hero who nobody else would agree with, but who does what needs to be done. A renegade. That's who he's always been. The prequel novel Revelation showcases that long before Sovereign, Saren was a ruthless agent. He took no prisoners and he gave no quarter. But he always had his own warped moral compass about his actions. This is no different. You can also see that his plan is stupid. This cycle has been repeated an uncountable amount of times. If this plan actually worked, then somebody would have tried it before and none of them would be here. You can try to point out to him that his plan makes no sense, but he's not willing to hear it. Of course he isn't. He's indoctrinated. Sovereign is pulling all the strings. This rationale is nothing more than Saren's own mental gymnastics to convince himself that any of this was his idea. He's not a figure to be feared, he's a figure to be pitied. Trapped in his own mind, thinking he's doing the right thing, when really he's just dooming the entire galaxy. Sympathy for Saren is important because the Reapers represent a truly existential threat. None of these petty squabbles matter. The Genophage doesn't matter, the Batarian proxy war doesn't matter, the Quarian and the Geth do not matter, not in the face of a threat this vast. The Paragon-Renegade split becomes a split between optimism and pessimism. Can all these different people with 1,000 years of history band together to stop this? Or do you need to drag them kicking and screaming across the finish line whether they like it or not? That's not the conflict which Mass Effect 1 explores, but it's sure as hell the one it sets up. Mass Effect 1 absolutely tells a self-contained story. You set out to accomplish a goal, and by the end you do accomplish that goal, but by the time you've done it, that goal feels like a temporary victory at best. There's not much role-playing to be done in the finale, it's mostly an action-packed race to stop Saren from unleashing the Reapers, but there is one absolutely critical conversation left. A long chat with a Prothean VI that fills in a lot of the gaps and sets the stage for the games to come. The VI, Vigil, walks you through the events of the Prothean extinction, the slow, centuries-long process of total genocide and the brave few who made your survival possible in the first place. It reveals that it wasn't the Protheans who built the mass relays or the Citadel, but the Reapers themselves, boons that made sure that all civilizations grew along the pathways that they wanted them to. The Citadel is not just a space station, but a giant mass relay, one that links to dark space, the space between galaxies where the Reapers slumber. When the signal was sent, the Reapers would flood through and cripple the heart of galactic society in an instant. The Citadel relay was supposed to open years ago, but a small team of surviving Protheans travelled to the Citadel and sabotaged it, ensuring that the Reapers couldn't open it, giving the next cycle a chance for survival. This also explains Sovereign's plan. It needs to gain access to the Citadel so it can call in the rest of the Reapers, but it doesn't want to risk just charging in there and doing it solo, because it's tough but not totally invincible. As a machine older than the dawn of time, it doesn't mind waiting a few years to make sure everything goes off without a hitch. It's worried about failure, which means failure is possible, which means there's still a chance to win. While it's not quite as dynamic or engaging as the suicide mission in Mass Effect 2, the finale of Mass Effect 1 is still a visual spectacle to behold. Sovereign and the Geth fleet charging the Citadel, Sovereign making its approach to the tower and then fighting up the side of the tower with Sovereign absolutely dominating the sky above you. You're an insect crawling around a giant, trying not to be stepped on, looking for the right place to bite. The final choice in the game comes after you defeated Saren, either with bullets or with words, passing a very high speech check to get him to resist Sovereign's control for just long enough to shoot himself in the head. The final choice is one that reflects the themes of the game. The human fleet is waiting and ready to come in and save the day. They can either come in early and save the Citadel Council, who were trying to evacuate but got caught by the Geth, or you can let the Council die and focus all fire on Sovereign. The Council have done absolutely nothing to gain your loyalty, and even practically every second you spend not shooting Sovereign is a second closer to the apocalypse. So even a Paragon can choose to let the Council die. You can tell the fleet to focus on Sovereign, without making it explicit that you don't care that the Council is going to be killed. The unfortunate truth is that this choice is a lot like the Rachni Queen back on Noveria. A choice that should matter a lot, but that ends up mattering annoyingly little. The promise of the Mass Effect trilogy is a very bold one. Your choices matter, but crafting choices that truly matter is so much more difficult than it sounds. For a choice like this to truly matter, Mass Effect 2 and 3 would have to be almost completely different games. It's too big of a political shift to be adequately captured within the bounds of a video game, so it's not. The promise is held up enough times to be extra disappointing when it's broken, which is why sometimes it's better to live in the illusion rather than embrace the reality. Maybe sometimes you should just save the Council and look the other way, which is a philosophy I think the Council would appreciate. Mass Effect ends in a completely heroic way. There is one final boss fight against Saren when Sovereign manipulates his corpse, turning him into a husk like the ones you've been facing all game, which is really not that much different to how he's been the whole time, maybe even more honest. But of course you win. Regardless of if you save the Council or not, Sovereign is defeated and the day is saved. There's a little fake out where the game pretends for a second that Shepard was killed by the debris, which is pretty ironic considering how Mass Effect 2 starts, but Shepard doesn't die. They jump out of the debris with a big old grin on their face. It's fully victorious. You won. Good job. And yet, it still feels entirely bittersweet. You won for now. You beat one Reaper and all it took was the entire Alliance fleet. What the hell are you gonna do when the rest of them show up? Mass Effect is a phenomenal Part 1. Trilogies are not usually planned as trilogies. If you compare this to Halo, for example, Halo Combat Evolved is a very self-contained story. It's Halo 2 that introduces all the plot threads and characters that carry over into Part 3. But all of the events and characters introduced in Mass Effect 1 are still absolutely central to Mass Effect 3. It was such an ambitious plan, the kind of ambition that the modern industry, with its half-decade-long production cycles and massive overblown budgets, would never dare to attempt. The kind of ambition that only a studio like BioWare in the mid-2000s could ever attempt. And the fact that the ambition paid off as well as it did is nothing short of miraculous. There are things that the future games do better than Mass Effect 1. They get glossier, more refined, bigger and bolder. But none of them would be possible without the immensely stable foundations that Mass Effect 1 created. Foundations so strong that even now, almost 20 years later, people are still hungry for more. And so am I, because me and Shepard both have a lot of work left to do.
Shepard's right. Humanity is ready to do its part. United with the rest of the Council, we have the strength to overcome any challenge. When the Reapers come, we must stand side by side. We must fight against them as one. And together, we will drive them back into dark space.
Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me. As well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. This video ended up much longer than I had intended, and I'm slightly worried that the next videos are going to be even longer, but much like Future Shepherd, that's Future Kyle's problem. If you're in the future, then you can find all of those videos in this playlist up here, or for something different, here's another video on an RPG that you might quite like. Now if you'll excuse me, I need a space nap before I get back to work again.